Chapter 14. The Agony of Neutrality. When war began in Europe, Roosevelt publicly insisted that the United States would remain neutral. His private concern, however, was how long Britain and France could withstand Germany, and what their defeat would mean for American security. The administration initially focused on strengthening the Western Hemisphere and expanding military production, while avoiding measures that could be portrayed as a commitment to war. Air power had become an early priority. The Munich crisis convinced Roosevelt that modern industrial warfare would be dominated by aircraft, and that American production capacity itself was a strategic weapon. He pressed for rapid expansion of the aircraft industry and larger military appropriations. Yet the armed forces remained small. Years of tight budgets and public hostility to militarization meant that the United States entered the European war crisis with limited modern equipment and only a modest number of heavy bombers. George C. Marshall became Army Chief of Staff on the day Germany invaded Poland. Kennedy presents Marshall as a crucial institutional leader, blunt, disciplined, strategically minded, and willing to remove officers he thought unfit for a vastly expanded army. His task was to transform a small peacetime force into an organization capable of modern continental warfare. Roosevelt also sought revision of the neutrality laws. Britain and France needed American weapons, but the existing statutes restricted sales. Congress eventually adopted a cash-and-carry system under which belligerents could buy arms if they paid immediately and transported them in their own ships. Because Britain controlled the Atlantic sea lanes and had access to dollars, the practical effect favored the Allies, while preserving a formal distinction between trade and military participation. For months, the war in Western Europe remained relatively quiet. This so-called phony war encouraged hopes that negotiation might still end the conflict. Roosevelt sent Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles to Europe in early 1940 to explore possibilities for mediation. Nothing came of the effort. Then Germany attacked in the West in May 1940. The Netherlands and Belgium were overwhelmed. German armor cut through the Ardennes and trapped Allied armies. The British evacuated more than 300,000 troops from Dunkirk, but France collapsed within weeks. The strategic assumptions underlying American neutrality were transformed. Britain now stood largely alone against a Germany that controlled much of continental Europe. Winston Churchill's refusal to negotiate mattered profoundly. The British attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir demonstrated how far Churchill would go to prevent important naval assets from falling under German influence. During the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force prevented Germany from securing the air superiority necessary for invasion. The Blitz then brought bombing directly to British cities. Roosevelt moved closer to Britain while trying not to outrun American opinion. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement transferred 50 aging American destroyers to Britain in exchange for long leases on British base sites in the Western Hemisphere. The deal strengthened Atlantic defense and gave Britain badly needed escort vessels, but Roosevelt executed it without an ordinary treaty, stretching presidential authority because he doubted the Senate would approve the arrangement quickly. The fall of France also made conscription politically possible. Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act in September 1940, creating the first peacetime draft in American history. Millions of men registered. The measure was a remarkable change for a country still officially at peace. The 1940 presidential election unfolded under the shadow of war. Roosevelt broke the two-term tradition and sought a third term. Republicans nominated Wendell Willkie, a businessman who criticized parts of the New Deal but was himself an internationalist. That choice narrowed the foreign policy differences between the major parties and helped prevent the election from becoming a simple referendum between intervention and isolation. Roosevelt promised that American boys would not be sent into foreign wars, language carefully compatible with continued aid to Britain and military preparation. He won, though by a smaller margin than in 1936. Kennedy emphasizes the political delicacy. Roosevelt believed Hitler's victory would endanger the United States, but he also knew that a premature attempt to enter the war could destroy his coalition and provoke a powerful isolationist backlash. Defense orders were already changing the domestic economy. Factories received aircraft, ship, vehicle, and munitions contracts. Idle industrial capacity began operating again. Unemployment fell. The irony was unmistakable. The military spending associated with a global catastrophe was accomplishing what years of New Deal experimentation had not. The Depression was beginning to end. As the United States prepared for a war it still hoped not to fight. The fall of France in June 1940 was the event that most transformed American strategic thinking before Pearl Harbor. France had been considered one of the world's great military powers. Its rapid defeat made it possible to imagine Britain collapsing as well. If Germany gained control over the industrial resources and Atlantic coastline of Europe, the physical security provided by the oceans looked less reassuring. Long-range aircraft, submarines, and modern fleets were making distance a weaker defense. The destroyers for bases bargain emerged from that emergency. Britain needed escort vessels immediately, while Roosevelt wanted access to bases from Newfoundland to the Caribbean that would extend hemispheric defense. Because a treaty would face uncertain Senate approval, the administration used an executive agreement and a legal opinion from Attorney General Robert Jackson. The episode expanded presidential freedom in foreign affairs and demonstrated Roosevelt's willingness to use legal innovation to move faster than public consensus. The peacetime draft was similarly revolutionary. The United States had traditionally demobilized after wars and relied on voluntary enlistment until emergencies. Conscription before entering a war implied that geography no longer allowed leisurely mobilization after hostilities began. The narrow congressional votes reflected how controversial the change remained. When the draft extension came up in 1941, the House approved it by only one vote, a reminder that interventionist policy was never politically inevitable. The 1940 election also mattered because Wilkie accepted much of the premise that Britain should be aided. He attacked Roosevelt's domestic record and third-term candidacy, but did not offer the isolationist alternative some Republicans preferred. This narrowed the space in which foreign policy could become a partisan reversal after the election. Roosevelt's victory could therefore be interpreted as support for preparedness, even if it was not a mandate for war. Military preparation revealed years of neglect. Units trained with inadequate equipment and maneuvers sometimes used improvised substitutes. Marshall's contribution was not only increasing numbers, but building an officer corps capable of leading a mass army. He promoted younger commanders, retired men he considered unsuitable, and insisted that the Army develop realistic, large-scale training. Many officers who would command in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific gained responsibilities during this accelerated rebuilding. The economic effect of rearmament confirms one of Kennedy's broader arguments. The federal government had spent too cautiously during the Depression to achieve full employment. Defense appropriations now rose because national security made deficits politically acceptable in a way relief spending had not. The economy responded. Factories reopened, investment returned, and workers were rehired. The distinction between what the country could afford and what politicians had previously been willing to spend became increasingly obvious. Britain's survival in 1940 was strategically essential because it preserved a base from which American power could later return to Europe. Had Britain fallen or negotiated a settlement, the United States would have faced a German-dominated Atlantic coast without the immense network of British ports, airfields, intelligence systems, and naval facilities that later supported Overlord and the bomber offensive. Aid to Britain, therefore, had consequences far beyond keeping one ally in the war. Roosevelt also expanded hemispheric defense through agreements with Latin American governments and through base construction. American planners worried about possible Axis footholds in the Atlantic, especially if European colonial possessions changed hands. The Caribbean, Greenland, Iceland, and the approaches to the Panama Canal acquired new strategic importance. The meaning of national defense was already expanding outward before formal entry into war. The draft and rearmament exposed the tension between military need and domestic schedules. Millions of young men were being taken from civilian life at the same time factories needed workers. Training camps themselves required housing, roads, uniforms, food, medical care, and equipment. Mobilization was therefore an economic program as much as a military one. Federal demand spread through communities that had seen little recovery during the New Deal years. Churchill's leadership mattered because British resistance created options for the United States. If Britain could survive through 1940 and 1941, American aid could accumulate, Soviet entry could alter the continental balance, and American rearmament could mature. Time itself became a strategic resource. Roosevelt's policy was increasingly designed to keep Britain in the war long enough for American industrial strength to become decisive. This explains the political importance of presenting aid as defense rather than charity. Destroyers, Bases, aircraft, and eventually Lend-Lease were justified on the claim that Britain was protecting the approaches to the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt steadily erased the practical distinction between British survival and American security without yet asking Congress for war. Chapter 15. To the brink. By late 1940, Britain was running out of dollars. Cash and carry had allowed it to buy American goods only so long as it could pay. British reserves were being exhausted, and the government began selling American investments and other assets. If the United States insisted on ordinary commercial payment, Britain could soon lose access to the industrial supply on which its survival depended. Roosevelt's answer was Lend-Lease. He explained the idea with a homely analogy. If a neighbor's house were on fire, one would lend him a garden hose rather than negotiate a sale while the flames spread. The United States would provide weapons and supplies to countries whose defense the president deemed vital to American security, with payment or return postponed until after the emergency. The proposal produced the Great Debate. Isolationists argued that Lend-Lease transferred congressional authority to the president, made the United States an undeclared partner in Britain's war, and would inevitably lead to American combat. The America First Committee mobilized prominent opponents, while Senator Burton Wheeler and other critics warned against becoming Britain's arsenal. Supporters replied that aiding Britain was the best way to keep the war away from the Western Hemisphere. Public opinion had shifted enough for Roosevelt to prevail. Congress approved Lend-Lease in March 1941 by substantial margins. The measure formally ended the old idea of impartial neutrality. The United States remained legally outside the war, but its industrial power was now committed to defeating the Axis. Roosevelt linked this policy to an ideological vision. In his January 1941 address to Congress, he described 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The first 2 belonged to familiar constitutional language. The latter 2 connected foreign policy to the social commitments of the New Deal. The world the United States should defend was one in which citizens possessed both political liberty and a measure of economic and physical security. Lend-Lease also accelerated mobilization. Roosevelt called for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy. Factories expanded, shipyards worked around the clock, and government contracts poured into heavy industry. The huge rise in federal demand finally produced the employment recovery that peacetime policies had failed to generate. The Atlantic became increasingly dangerous. American forces occupied or protected strategic positions and extended patrols. Naval escorts moved farther into the ocean. Germany's submarines threatened the shipping lanes that carried supplies to Britain. Incidents involving American destroyers, including the Greer, Kearney, and Reuben James, blurred the line between neutrality and undeclared naval warfare. Roosevelt authorized increasingly aggressive action against Axis vessels in waters important to hemispheric defense. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 transformed the diplomatic landscape. Stalin, Hitler's former temporary partner, became an indispensable enemy of Germany. Roosevelt extended aid to the Soviet Union despite deep American hostility to communism. Strategic necessity created a coalition that ideological affinity never could have produced. The Pacific crisis developed simultaneously. Japan had spent years expanding on the Asian mainland and remained heavily dependent on imported oil and other strategic materials, much of them obtained directly or indirectly from the United States. American officials wanted Japan to withdraw from China and stop further expansion. Economic sanctions increased as Japanese forces moved into Indochina. The dilemma was dangerous. Sanctions could restrain Japan if leaders in Tokyo decided expansion had become too expensive. But an oil embargo could also create a deadline. Japan's navy could not fight a long war without petroleum. If access to American oil disappeared, Japanese leaders might conclude that they had to seize the resource-rich Dutch East Indies before their stockpiles ran down. After Japan moved into southern Indochina in 1941, Washington froze Japanese assets, effectively cutting off oil. Negotiations continued through ambassadors Kichisaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu. American officials considered temporary compromises, but domestic and allied objections narrowed the room for agreement. Secretary of State Hull's note of November 26 called for Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina and principles fundamentally incompatible with Tokyo's imperial project. American military planners did not want war with Japan at this moment. Their strategic priority was Germany. A Pacific War would divide resources and complicate aid to Britain and the Soviet Union. Yet, Kennedy stresses that Washington would not purchase delay by accepting Japan's conquest of China. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Japanese diplomacy was operating under strict deadlines, and that military preparations were advanced, though the specific target remained unknown. Secretary of War Henry Stimson recorded the problem as how to maneuver Japan into firing the first shot without exposing the country to unacceptable danger. That sentence has often been used to support conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor. Kennedy explicitly rejects the claim that Roosevelt knowingly sacrificed the Pacific Fleet. He finds no credible evidence that the administration knew the attack would fall on Hawaii. On December 6th, Roosevelt sent a final message to the Japanese emperor. American officials read additional intercepted messages indicating that negotiations were breaking down. Roosevelt's conclusion was stark. War was coming. The question of where and how would be answered the next morning. Lend-Lease also altered the concept of national defense. Roosevelt argued that the security of the United States could depend on events beyond American territory. Britain did not have to be formally allied with the United States for its survival to be considered vital. This reasoning moved foreign policy away from the old distinction between peace at home and war abroad, toward a concept of strategic interdependence. The material scale soon became enormous. Lend-Lease would send tens of billions of dollars in weapons, vehicles, food, industrial goods, and raw materials to allied countries. Britain received aid while surrendering much of its previous financial position. The Soviet Union later received trucks, locomotives, communications equipment, food, and other supplies that supported its vast land war. The program used America's productive capacity as a substitute for immediate American manpower, while the armed forces were still preparing. The Atlantic incidents demonstrate how far policy moved before formal war. American warships reported submarine positions, escorted traffic in broad security zones, and eventually received orders to shoot Axis vessels threatening navigation. The sinking of the Reuben James with heavy loss of life did not produce a declaration of war, but by late 1941, the Atlantic relationship between the United States and Germany was neutrality, largely in legal name. Japan posed a different strategic geometry. American planners feared a two-ocean war, and the Philippines were exposed. Economic pressure was therefore meant to deter Japanese expansion without triggering immediate combat, but sanctions interacted with Japan's own strategic assumptions. The more Japan depended on finite oil reserves, the more a prolonged embargo made waiting dangerous. American pressure could make compromise rational from Washington's perspective, while making rapid military seizure of Southeast Asian resources appear rational to Japanese leaders. The final negotiations failed, partly because the two governments defined the status quo differently. Washington wanted restoration of Chinese sovereignty and resistance to force. Tokyo viewed its position in China as the result of years of blood and expenditure that could not simply be abandoned. Temporary arrangements were discussed, but neither side trusted the other enough to convert delay into a durable settlement. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech gives the chapter its connection to the book's title. Freedom from want and freedom from fear extended the domestic moral language of the New Deal into international affairs. Roosevelt was beginning to argue that American security depended on a world in which political and economic conditions did not continually generate dictatorship and war. Whether the United States could actually build such a world would become the central problem of the post-war era. The Atlantic Charter, issued by Roosevelt and Churchill in August 1941 after meeting off Newfoundland, gave political form to their growing partnership. It spoke of self-determination, freer trade, economic cooperation, improved labor standards, social security, and a peace in which nations could live free from fear and want. The language echoed Roosevelt's Four Freedoms and projected New Deal concepts onto the international order. Yet it also contained ambiguities, especially for colonial peoples who wondered whether self-determination applied to them. The United States and Britain had already begun staff conversations that established the Germany First principle. American planners judged Germany the more dangerous Axis power because of its industrial base, scientific capacity, control of continental Europe, and potential access to Atlantic resources. Japan threatened American possessions and interests in Asia, but a German victory over Britain or the Soviet Union could fundamentally alter the global balance. This strategic judgment would govern American allocation even after Pearl Harbor. Domestic opinion continued to move gradually rather than all at once. Each German success, each submarine incident, and each new measure of aid made outright isolation less plausible. But large numbers of Americans still opposed entering the war until December. Kennedy's account therefore rejects retrospective inevitability. The country came to intervention through accumulating decisions under pressure, not through a hidden plan whose endpoint was fixed from the beginning. The mobilization of 1941 also transformed relations between government and industry before Pearl Harbor. Washington financed new capacity, guaranteed contracts, and negotiated priorities for scarce materials. Corporate executives entered federal agencies, while New Deal administrators learned to work with firms they had previously regulated. The institutional partnership required for wartime production was already being assembled during formal peace. At the same time, Roosevelt's rhetoric prepared a moral justification broader than traditional national defense. The Four Freedoms made the conflict about the social conditions under which people could live securely. That language later helped connect military victory to plans for post-war employment, social protection, trade, and international institutions. Chapter 16. War in the Pacific. Before dawn on December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers approached Hawaii under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. More than 300 aircraft launched in successive waves toward Pearl Harbor. American radar operators detected the incoming planes, but warnings were misunderstood or delayed. The attack achieved tactical surprise. Battleship Rose suffered the most dramatic damage. 18 American naval vessels were sunk or heavily damaged, including 8 battleships. Roughly 180 aircraft were destroyed and many more damaged. 2,403 Americans were killed and 178 wounded. The USS Arizona alone became a tomb for more than 1,000 men. Yet the attack missed several assets that would prove strategically decisive. The American aircraft carriers were at sea, the submarine base survived, and vital fuel storage and repair facilities were largely untouched. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan the next day. Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States on December 11th. Hitler's decision removed a political difficulty from Roosevelt's strategy. The United States could now pursue the Germany First policy agreed with Britain without having to persuade an enraged public that the main American effort should target a country that had not attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan's initial victories were extraordinary. Japanese forces struck across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Guam, and other positions. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under Douglas MacArthur withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor. They suffered hunger, disease, and lack of supplies before surrendering in the spring of 1942. MacArthur was ordered to escape to Australia, leaving General Jonathan Wainwright to endure the final capitulation. The strategic logic behind Japan's offensive was to seize a defensive perimeter and the resources necessary for self-sufficiency, then make reconquest so expensive that the United States would negotiate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto doubted this assumption. He believed Japan could run wild for perhaps 6 months or a year, but could not guarantee success in a prolonged industrial war against the United States. The timetable began to break at the Coral Sea in May 1942. American codebreakers had gained insight into Japanese plans, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position carriers against an operation aimed at Port Moresby. The battle was tactically ambiguous and fought entirely by carrier aircraft whose ships never directly saw one another. Strategically, it stopped the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby and demonstrated that carrier aviation had become the central weapon of naval warfare. The next month came Midway. American intelligence identified the Japanese objective despite Tokyo's efforts at deception. Nimitz placed the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway. Japanese aircraft struck the island while American carrier groups searched for Nagumo's force. In a few decisive minutes, American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers with decks crowded by aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk. The United States lost Yorktown, but Japan lost the core of the carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, along with irreplaceable experienced aviators. Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it destroyed Japan's ability to dictate the strategic pace. The contest then shifted to the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, Marines landed on Guadalcanal to seize an unfinished Japanese airfield that threatened Allied communications with Australia. The campaign became a brutal 6-month struggle on land, sea, and air. American Marines held Henderson Field while Japanese forces repeatedly tried to retake it. Naval battles around the island were so destructive that the surrounding waters became known as Iron Bottom Sound. At Savo Island, the United States and its allies suffered a disastrous early defeat. On land, the Marines repelled attacks at places such as Bloody Ridge. Disease and hunger were constant enemies. Japanese soldiers suffered especially severe starvation, as American air and naval control made resupply increasingly difficult. The November 1942 Naval Battle of Guadalcanal helped decide the campaign. Japan eventually evacuated surviving troops in February 1943. The Americans had proved that they could conduct sustained offensive operations, but the cost revealed how difficult the road toward Japan would be. MacArthur simultaneously fought along New Guinea. Operations around Buna and other positions exposed weaknesses in American jungle warfare and logistics, but gradually pushed Japanese forces back. The Allies then developed a strategy of bypassing rather than storming every fortified position. Under Operation Cartwheel, they isolated the major Japanese base at Rabaul instead of paying the enormous price of taking it directly. Code-breaking remained crucial. American intelligence identified Yamamoto's planned inspection flight in 1943. Long-range P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down his aircraft, killing the admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor. The episode demonstrated the growing integration of intelligence, technology, and operational reach. By early 1944, the strategic initiative had passed decisively to the United States. The war would increasingly become an exercise in applying overwhelming industrial and logistical power across enormous ocean distances. Japan had won a spectacular opening campaign. It had not solved the fundamental problem Yamamoto understood from the beginning: how to defeat a continental industrial power whose productive capacity was only starting to mobilize. Pearl Harbor unified American opinion in a way years of presidential persuasion never could. Before December 7th, intervention remained contested. After the attack, the congressional vote for war against Japan was nearly unanimous. The emotional and political problem was no longer whether the United States should fight, but how to reconcile public fury against Japan with the strategic decision to concentrate first on Germany. The damage at Pearl Harbor also accelerated the naval revolution already underway. Battleships suffered spectacular destruction, but carriers survived because they were absent. The coming battles at Coral Sea and Midway would confirm that the decisive striking arm of a fleet was now aircraft launched from mobile airfields at sea. Battleships remained important for bombardment and anti-aircraft defense, but they no longer occupied the strategic position planners had assumed before the war. The Philippines exposed the consequences of unpreparedness and distance. Reinforcement after Pearl Harbor became nearly impossible. Baton's defenders survived on reduced rations while disease spread and ammunition dwindled. The surrender was followed by the Bataan Death March and brutal captivity under Japanese forces, experiences that hardened American attitudes toward the Pacific enemy and influenced the war's later intensity. Midway, by contrast, showed the value of intelligence. American cryptanalysts had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to infer the target designated by the code name AF. A deliberate message from Midway about a water shortage helped confirm the identification when Japanese communications reported that AF lacked water. Nimitz could therefore place his carriers in ambush. The result depended on courage and chance in the air, but the opportunity had been created by information. Guadalcanal illustrates how close early American offensives were to failure. The Marines landed before the United States possessed overwhelming local superiority. Carrier support was withdrawn after losses and fears of further Japanese attack. Supply was uncertain, and Japanese naval forces controlled surrounding waters on many nights. The campaign became a contest over Henderson Field, because whoever controlled the airstrip could contest daylight movement around the island. American endurance there prevented Japan from regaining the initiative. The later strategy of bypassing strongpoints made material superiority more efficient. Rather than attack every island, American forces could seize positions that provided airfields and naval bases, then isolate Japanese garrisons. Cut off from shipping and air support, those garrisons ceased to affect the larger campaign even if they remained undefeated. This approach turned distance, once an American weakness, into a problem the Navy and engineering system could systematically solve. The Japanese victories of early 1942 also shattered racial stereotypes in the opposite direction from those Hitler held about Americans. Western empires had often assumed Asian forces could not defeat modern European armies. The fall of Singapore, the destruction of Allied naval forces, and the conquest of the Philippines disproved that complacency. Japan's success inspired anti-colonial movements, even where Japanese occupation itself became brutal. American strategy in the Pacific divided operational authority between Nimitz in the Central Pacific and MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific. The arrangement reflected both geography and personalities. MacArthur insisted on returning to the Philippines, while naval planners favored a more direct advance across the central island chains. Rather than choose one route exclusively, the United States eventually possessed enough resources to support both, another example of material abundance, solving strategic disputes that poorer powers could not afford. The cost of the Pacific War was magnified by distance. Every landing required ships carrying fuel, construction equipment, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement aircraft. Engineers often had to build usable harbors and airfields almost immediately after combat troops landed. Seabees became as important to the campaign's momentum as many fighting formations. Island hopping was therefore not a sequence of isolated battles, but a moving, logistical architecture. American racial attitudes toward Japan also shaped the Pacific War. Propaganda frequently portrayed Japanese people in explicitly racialized and dehumanizing ways. Japanese military atrocities and brutal treatment of prisoners intensified hatred. But pre-existing anti-Asian prejudice gave the conflict a different cultural character from the war against Germany. The same society that imprisoned Japanese-American citizens was fighting an enemy whose regime also mobilized racial and imperial ideologies. The Pacific Campaign's brutality cannot be separated from this mutual dehumanization and from the military fact that many Japanese units fought to destruction rather than surrender. As the United States moved closer to the home islands, commanders expected resistance to become more severe, an expectation that shaped bombing strategy and invasion planning in 1945. Chapter 17, Unready Ally, Uneasy Alliance. America's entry into the war did not instantly produce military strength. Kennedy emphasizes that the United States became an ally before it became a fully prepared combatant. The armed forces were expanding at extraordinary speed, but equipment, training, shipping, and command structures still had to be built. At the same time, Washington had to coordinate strategy with Britain and the Soviet Union, partners whose interests overlapped but did not coincide. The Battle of the Atlantic was the first emergency. German submarines exploited America's initially weak coastal defenses in Operation Drumbeat. Tankers and merchant ships were sunk within sight of American shores. Cities were slow to enforce blackouts, convoy systems were incomplete, and the Navy lacked enough escorts. In the first months of 1942, German U-boats destroyed shipping at a rate that threatened the entire Allied war effort. The Atlantic problem was global. Britain depended on imports for food, fuel, and industrial materials. American forces could not fight in Europe or Africa without transport. Lend-Lease supplies for the Soviet Union also had to cross dangerous waters. Arctic convoys to Murmansk faced submarines, aircraft, surface ships, weather, and darkness. The destruction of convoy PQ-17 after it was ordered to scatter became one of the most infamous Allied shipping disasters. Gradually, the balance changed. More escorts entered service. Long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers brought aircraft protection to convoys. Radar, direction finding, improved depth charges, and intelligence from German communications increased the effectiveness of anti-submarine warfare. Most importantly, Allied shipyards built merchant vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. By 1943, the submarine campaign was no longer capable of cutting the transatlantic lifeline. The larger strategic argument concerned where American and British ground forces should fight Germany. General Marshall favored the earliest practical cross-channel invasion of France. American planners developed concepts called bolero, roundup, and sledgehammer, all aimed in different ways at building toward a direct assault on northwestern Europe. Marshall believed concentration was a fundamental principle of war. The Allies should strike the main enemy through the shortest route rather than disperse resources around the Mediterranean. The Soviet Union strongly agreed on the need for a second front. the Red Army was absorbing the overwhelming weight of German ground combat. Soviet representatives repeatedly demanded that Britain and the United States attack France and force Hitler to shift divisions westward. Roosevelt gave Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov assurances in 1942 that encouraged expectations of such a front. Churchill resisted. Britain had already suffered major defeats and did not believe Anglo-American forces were ready to storm the French coast in 1942. He preferred operations on the imperial periphery, particularly North Africa and the Mediterranean. Such campaigns could employ available forces, protect British interests, and weaken Axis positions without risking an immediate catastrophe in France. The dispute became sharp enough that Marshal and Admiral Ernest King considered threatening to redirect American resources toward the Pacific if Britain refused a European operation. Roosevelt rejected that threat. He remained committed to defeating Germany first, and insisted that American ground troops engage Germans in 1942. The compromise was Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa in November. Torch brought American forces into large-scale combat against Germany, but it also postponed the cross-channel invasion. After fighting through Tunisia, the Allies accepted the surrender of roughly 250,000 Axis troops in May 1943. They then moved into Sicily and Italy. Churchill saw the Mediterranean as strategically productive. American planners increasingly regarded it as a diversion from the main route into Germany. The air war was another arena in which doctrine met reality. American airmen believed heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could conduct daylight precision bombing deep into Germany without fighter escorts. The 8th Air Force began operations from Britain in 1942 and attacked submarine facilities, factories, rail yards, and industrial targets. Early successes created confidence, but long-range missions exposed the flaw. German fighters inflicted devastating losses. The raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943 were especially costly. On the second major Schweinfurt mission, 60 B-17s were lost and hundreds of airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Without escort fighters capable of reaching targets deep inside Germany, daylight bombing at that loss rate was unsustainable. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was changing the land war. The German defeat at Stalingrad and the enormous tank battle at Kursk demonstrated that Hitler had lost the strategic initiative in the east. Soviet armies began moving west. This eased fears that the Soviet Union might collapse, but created a new anxiety. If the Western Allies delayed too long, the Red Army might liberate and dominate most of Europe before Anglo-American armies arrived. The alliance was therefore uneasy by design. Stalin believed Britain and the United States were postponing the Second Front while Russians died. Churchill feared Soviet expansion. Roosevelt hoped personal diplomacy could hold the coalition together until Germany was defeated. All three leaders understood that wartime military decisions were already shaping the political map of post-war Europe. The strategic disagreement between Americans and British was partly a disagreement produced by geography and memory. Britain had fought Germany since 1939, had already lost large numbers of men, and had experienced Dunkirk, Greece, Crete, and other reverses. Churchill therefore valued indirect operations that accumulated advantages, while avoiding a premature frontal assault. American officers, protected by distance and newly mobilizing enormous resources, worried that such peripheral campaigns would dissipate strength and postpone the decisive blow indefinitely. The Soviet perspective was harsher still. German forces killed Soviet soldiers and civilians on a scale unmatched in the West. From Moscow, every delay in opening France looked like a choice to let Russians bear the war. Stalin's suspicions were intensified by ideological hostility and by the Western intervention against the Bolsheviks after the First World War. Military timetables therefore became evidence in a deeper political argument about trust. Torch and the Mediterranean campaign had real benefits despite delaying Overlord. American troops gained combat experience in North Africa, where early defeats exposed weaknesses in command, training, and coordination. Eisenhower learned coalition command. Logistics systems were tested. The invasion of Sicily helped remove Mussolini and forced Germany to occupy Italy. Yet Italy's mountainous terrain turned the peninsula into a difficult battlefield that absorbed troops without providing a direct route to the German industrial heartland. The bombing losses of 1943 likewise forced doctrinal learning. The assumption that bomber formations could defend themselves with machine guns proved false against concentrated fighter attack. Crews faced statistical odds that became psychologically unbearable when losses approached 10% on individual missions. Only long-range escort fighters and a deliberate campaign against the Luftwaffe made sustained daylight bombing practical. The alliance with the Soviet Union forced Americans to distinguish between wartime necessity and political approval. Stalin's dictatorship, purges, and pre-war pact with Hitler were not forgotten. Yet German invasion made Soviet survival indispensable to the defeat of Germany. Lend-Lease to Moscow therefore reflected a strategic calculation that supporting Soviet armies was cheaper in American lives than allowing Germany to concentrate its entire strength in the West. The Soviet contribution was indeed enormous. The Eastern Front consumed most German ground forces and inflicted the majority of German military losses. This fact strengthened Stalin's bargaining position and deepened Soviet resentment over the delayed Western invasion. Kennedy's treatment of Allied strategy continually reminds the listener that American and British victory in Europe depended on sacrifices made by a regime they would soon confront as an adversary. Mediterranean operations also had political effects. The invasion of Italy contributed to Mussolini's fall, but Germany quickly occupied much of the peninsula and restored him as head of a puppet regime in the north. The Allied advance then became slow and costly through mountainous terrain and fortified lines. The Italian campaign showed that removing an enemy government did not necessarily remove enemy military power from the battlefield. Coalition warfare also required a common allocation of scarce shipping. Every division sent to North Africa, every aircraft delivered to the Soviet Union, and every convoy sent to Britain competed for cargo space. Strategy therefore depended on logistics at the alliance level. The combined chiefs of staff became an institutional mechanism through which British and American leaders negotiated priorities, rather than simply issuing national plans. The war strengthened the American preference for concentrated, scheduled operations supported by enormous material preparation. British experience encouraged flexibility and peripheral maneuver. The eventual Allied strategy combined both traditions, but the rising weight of American manpower and production gradually gave Washington greater influence over where the coalition would strike. Chapter 18: The War of Machines. Kennedy describes America's decisive wartime advantage as a combination of industrial scale, technology, administrative capacity, and physical distance from enemy destruction. Axis leaders understood parts of this reality but often underestimated how completely the United States could convert civilian production into military power. Roosevelt set staggering production goals in early 1942. Tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks, anti-aircraft guns, merchant ships, and other weapons. The numbers seemed unrealistic. Yet the federal government possessed financial resources and authority on a scale far beyond anything attempted during the New Deal. War contracts, plant construction, priorities, price controls, rationing, and labor allocation transformed the economy. Large corporations received a disproportionate share of military contracts. More than two-thirds of prime contracts went to the largest 100 firms, and a small group of industrial giants accounted for roughly half. General Motors alone became a major fraction of the entire procurement system. The government financed new factories that private companies operated, accelerating the concentration of American industry. Kennedy notes that wartime mobilization strengthened the very corporate institutions New Dealers had often distrusted. The financing of the war produced an equally important fiscal revolution. Federal spending rose to levels unimaginable in the 1930s. The Revenue Act of 1942 broadened the income tax from a levy paid mostly by affluent citizens into a mass tax. The number of individual taxpayers increased from only a few million before the war to more than 40 million by its end. Marginal rates at the top became extremely high, while payroll withholding made tax collection a routine part of ordinary employment. Taxes did not cover the entire cost. The government borrowed on an enormous scale. War bond campaigns sold securities to households, while banks and other institutions absorbed large quantities of public debt. Roughly speaking, current taxes financed less than half of wartime expenditures, and borrowing covered much of the rest. The war therefore created a mass fiscal state, as well as a military-industrial one. Mobilization generated conflict over how much the economy could produce. Military planners demanded ever larger quantities of weapons. Economists such as Simon Kuznets warned that goals had to be reconciled with actual supplies of labor, raw materials, and industrial capacity. This feasibility dispute forced the government to distinguish between aspirational requirements and physically achievable production. The eventual output was nevertheless extraordinary. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war years. They built immense numbers of trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, landing craft, merchant ships, radios, engines, and machine tools. The B-24 Liberator became one of the most mass-produced large aircraft in history. B-17s filled the skies over Europe, and later, B-29 superfortresses embodied the combination of advanced engineering and industrial repetition. This output sustained not only American forces, but the Allies. The Soviet Union received trucks, locomotives, rail equipment, jeeps, communications gear, food, and raw materials. Britain received aircraft, ships, weapons, and supplies. By 1944, American munitions production exceeded that of Germany and Japan combined and represented an enormous share of total Allied armament. Logistics turned production into battlefield power. The United States could supply each combat soldier with vastly more food, fuel, ammunition, medical equipment, vehicles, and communications gear than Japan could provide its troops. American armies were highly mechanized. Trucks replaced much animal transport. Bulldozers, portable bridges, fuel pipelines, repair units, and standardized parts allowed forces to move and recover with a speed that was itself a weapon. Scientific mobilization expanded the advantage. Radar, sonar, proximity fuses, amphibious vehicles, rockets, new medical techniques, and improved communications emerged from cooperation among universities, corporations, laboratories, and the military. The federal government became a major sponsor of scientific research, setting precedents that would survive the war. No project illustrated this new system more dramatically than the atomic bomb. Refugee scientists fleeing European fascism had warned that nuclear fission might make an unprecedented weapon possible. The United States organized the Manhattan Project under General Leslie Groves, with J. Robert Oppenheimer directing the scientific laboratory at Los Alamos. Enormous facilities at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and elsewhere pursued different methods of producing fission material. The project cost billions of dollars and employed a vast workforce, most of whom did not know the ultimate purpose of their labor. It required huge quantities of electricity, specialized materials, industrial construction, and scientific talent. Germany and Japan conducted nuclear research, but neither could match the American ability to devote resources simultaneously to an experimental weapon and to a global conventional war. Kennedy's larger argument is that American victory cannot be understood only through battlefield courage or generalship. It depended on an economic system that could mobilize machines, money, science, and labor on a continental scale, while the country's industrial heartland remained beyond enemy bombing. By the end of 1943, the Axis confronted an adversary whose material superiority was becoming overwhelming. War production also transformed the balance between civilian and military consumption. The government stopped civilian automobile production, restricted construction, allocated steel and aluminum, and rationed scarce goods. Families who had recently endured unemployment now often possessed money but could not purchase the durable goods they wanted. Personal saving, therefore, rose sharply. This accumulation of deferred demand was one of the economic forces waiting to be released after victory. Price control was essential because full employment and military procurement placed enormous purchasing power against a constrained supply of civilian goods. The Office of Price Administration imposed ceilings and rationing. Black markets appeared, and controls generated complaints, but inflation remained far below what might have occurred in an uncontrolled mobilization. The contrast with the First World War strengthened confidence that national economic management could work. Labor became scarce enough that the war drew workers previously excluded or underused into industry. Women, Southern migrants, black workers, and rural Americans entered jobs opened by military demand. The same economy that had treated millions of people as surplus during the Depression now struggled to find enough labor. Kennedy's juxtaposition is intentional. The human capacity had existed all along. What changed was the level of demand and the political willingness to mobilize it. Corporate concentration also acquired a new legitimacy. New dealers had spent years worrying that large firms possessed excessive power. War planners now needed exactly the organizational capacity that giant manufacturers offered: engineering staffs, management systems, access to capital, standardized production, and national supplier networks. The wartime state and big business became partners, helping create the institutional foundations of the post-war military-industrial economy. The Manhattan Project pushed this partnership into basic science, universities, government laboratories, industrial corporations, and the military worked under extraordinary secrecy. The project demonstrated that the federal government could organize scientific research at a scale previously associated only with industrial engineering. That model would influence post-war funding in physics, medicine, aeronautics, electronics, and eventually space exploration. Industrial mobilization relied on thousands of subcontractors as well as giant prime contractors. A bomber or tank contained components produced across a national network of machine shops, electrical firms, chemical plants, and metalworks. Federal procurement therefore transmitted war demand deeply into the economy. Regions that secured major plants experienced population growth, housing shortages, and new political influence, especially the South and West. The war also altered agriculture. Military demand, Allied food needs, and rising civilian incomes pushed farm prices and incomes upward. Mechanization accelerated as labor left farms for the military or factories. Tractors and combines helped fewer workers produce more food. Rural America, devastated in the early 1930s, entered the post-war era with higher incomes and a faster movement toward large-scale commercial farming. Medical logistics were another dimension of machine warfare. Penicillin production expanded dramatically. Blood plasma systems, surgical techniques, evacuation chains, and preventative medicine meant that wounded American soldiers had a much better chance of survival than in earlier wars. The capacity to preserve manpower was part of the same industrial scientific system that produced weapons. The mobilized economy, therefore, cannot be reduced to factories making guns. It was a coordinated system of taxation, borrowing, science, transportation, agriculture, medicine, labor allocation, price control, and mass production. Kennedy's point is that American power came from the integration of these systems more than from any single weapon. The war economy also narrowed class differences in employment. Full employment increased bargaining power even for workers who never joined unions. Employers had to compete for labor, and overtime provided additional income. At the same time, taxes reached much farther down the income scale, making millions of households direct participants in financing the federal state. Wartime citizenship thus combined new earnings with new obligations. Federal spending redistributed economic activity geographically. The Pacific Coast became a center of aircraft and ship production. The South gained military bases and factories. Western states received large investments in power, metals, and training facilities. These shifts helped create the post-war economic map, in which California and the broader Sun Belt would play much larger roles. Chapter 19. The Struggle for a Second Front. By late 1943, the Allies were winning, but victory raised rather than eliminated disputes about strategy and politics. The central question remained the Second Front in France. The Americans wanted a firm commitment to a cross-channel invasion. Churchill continued to see opportunities in the Mediterranean and Balkans. Stalin demanded a Western offensive that would relieve pressure on Soviet forces and limit the enormous Soviet sacrifice. The Allied conferences at Cairo and Tehran brought these tensions together. At Cairo, Roosevelt and Churchill met Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. China was formerly one of the great Allied powers, but its military position was precarious. Japan controlled much of the Chinese coast and important interior regions. The loss of the Burma Road left China dependent on air supply over the Himalayas, the dangerous route known as the Hump. American General Joseph Stilwell tried to improve Chinese armies and open a new land route through Burma. His relationship with Chiang was poisonous. Stilwell regarded the Chinese nationalist government as corrupt and militarily ineffective. Chiang distrusted Stilwell's demands and conserved forces for the expected post-war struggle with Chinese communists. American investment in the China theater produced chronic frustration. At Tehran, Roosevelt met Stalin face-to-face for the first time. Roosevelt hoped personal diplomacy could overcome Soviet suspicion. He was willing to tease Churchill, and sometimes appeared to side with Stalin in order to establish rapport. Kennedy does not treat this as simple naivete. Roosevelt's immediate objective was to preserve the alliance necessary to defeat Germany, though his confidence that personal trust could moderate Stalin had limits. The conference finally settled the military question. The Western Allies committed themselves to Operation Overlord, the invasion of northern France, in the spring of 1944. Stalin promised a major Soviet offensive to coincide with it. Churchill's efforts to shift the center of gravity toward the Mediterranean failed. The cross-channel attack would receive priority. command also had to be settled. Marshall had long expected and hoped to command the invasion. Roosevelt, instead, chose Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander. Marshall's organizational ability made him almost indispensable in Washington, and Roosevelt did not want to lose the Chief of Staff who coordinated the entire American Army. Eisenhower had also demonstrated exceptional skill managing British and American officers whose strategic and personal rivalries could easily have fractured coalition command. German commanders prepared for the invasion but disagreed about how to defeat it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed armored reserves should be held inland and concentrated after the Allies revealed the main landing area. Erwin Rommel argued that Allied air superiority would make large daylight movements impossible once the invasion began. The enemy therefore had to be destroyed on the beaches before a secure lodgment was established. Hitler's command system compromised between the two views and retained personal control over key reserves, reducing flexibility. The Allies needed air superiority before Overlord could succeed. The strategic bombing campaign had suffered unacceptable losses in 1943 because American bombers lacked long-range escorts. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang transformed the situation. Equipped with drop tanks, fighters could accompany bombers deep into Germany and then attack the Luftwaffe aggressively. During Big Week in February 1944, Allied bombers attacked German aircraft production in a concentrated campaign. The factories were not permanently destroyed, but German fighter forces suffered heavy losses trying to intercept the raids. American fighter commanders increasingly defined their task not simply as protecting bombers, but as hunting and destroying German aircraft wherever they could be found. The Luftwaffe began losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. Political questions also surrounded liberated France. Charles de Gaulle had built the Free French movement into a claim to national authority. Roosevelt distrusted him and resisted treating his organization as the legitimate government of France. American planners even contemplated administering liberated areas through Allied military government. Yet de Gaulle possessed domestic legitimacy that could not be manufactured by Washington. As French territory was liberated, his movement rapidly established political control. By the spring of 1944, the preparations in Britain had reached unprecedented scale. Millions of troops, thousands of aircraft, landing craft, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and food were assembled across southern England. The strategic argument that had consumed Allied planning since 1942 was ending. The question was no longer whether the Western Allies would return to France, but whether the most complex amphibious invasion in history could establish itself against German defenses. The China theater also revealed the difference between symbolic great power status and actual military capacity. Roosevelt wanted China recognized as one of the major Allied powers, partly because a strong post-war China might stabilize Asia and counterbalance both Japan and European colonialism. But the nationalist government controlled a fragmented country, faced internal corruption and inflation, and still confronted communist rivals. The American vision of China as a future pillar of order rested on hopes that wartime reality did not justify. Tehran's importance was therefore not only that Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill agreed on Overlord, it was the moment military strategy and post-war diplomacy became inseparable. Stalin wanted territorial security in Eastern Europe. Churchill worried about the balance of power. Roosevelt concentrated on preserving great power cooperation and creating an international organization that would include, rather than isolate, the Soviet Union. Each leader entered the conference with different memories of the failed post-1918 settlement. Eisenhower's selection for Overlord reflected coalition requirements. He was not generally regarded as the most brilliant battlefield tactician in the Allied command. His exceptional skill was maintaining cooperation among strong personalities and national commands. Overlord required British, American, Canadian, French, naval, air, and ground forces to execute a single plan. Political command was therefore itself a military asset. The air campaign before D-Day was deliberately redirected toward targets that supported the invasion. Railroads, bridges, and transportation centers in France were attacked to make it harder for Germany to reinforce Normandy. Churchill and others worried about French civilian casualties. The bombing illustrates another wartime dilemma Kennedy repeatedly presents. Policies could be strategically rational while imposing terrible costs on the populations the Allies claimed to liberate. The strategic bombing campaign before Overlord deliberately targeted German fighters as much as factories. Once P-51 escorts could accompany bombers, German pilots had to fight under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Experienced airmen were killed, while replacements entered combat with less training because fuel and instructors were scarce. The Luftwaffe could still inflict losses, but it could no longer contest the invasion skies on equal terms. The Mediterranean debate persisted even after Overlord was approved. Churchill hoped operations in the Balkans might limit Soviet influence after the war, while American planners feared such schemes would delay the decisive Western attack. This disagreement demonstrates how rapidly wartime strategy was becoming post-war strategy. The route armies took toward Germany could influence which governments and territories they encountered first. Roosevelt's handling of de Gaulle also illustrates the limits of presidential preference. The president distrusted the French leader's authoritarian style and inflated claims, but French political legitimacy could not be designed in Washington. De Gaulle's forces and networks inside France gave him an authority that Allied military government lacked. Once Paris was liberated, political reality overrode Roosevelt's reluctance. The struggle over the Second Front also concerned casualties. American planners believed that delaying the main invasion allowed Germany to strengthen coastal defenses and prolong Soviet losses. But an invasion launched before adequate landing craft, air superiority, and trained divisions were available could fail catastrophically. Dieppe, the disastrous Canadian-led raid of 1942, had shown what a frontal landing against prepared defenses could cost. Overlord's postponement was therefore not merely political hesitation, it also purchased preparation. By 1944, the Allies possessed the required margin, control of the Atlantic, air superiority, huge landing fleets, mature command arrangements, and a buildup of troops in Britain that Germany could not match. The invasion succeeded partly because 2 years of argument produced a concentration of resources large enough to survive mistakes on the beaches. Chapter 20. The Battle for Northwest Europe. The United States Army that crossed the English Channel in 1944 bore little resemblance to the small force that had existed 4 years earlier. The Army had grown from fewer than 200,000 men before mobilization to more than 7 million. Across all services, roughly 16 million American men and about 500,000 women served during the war. The mobilization itself revealed the health and educational condition of the population. Draft examinations uncovered dental problems, disease, malnutrition, illiteracy, and other deficiencies that reflected the inequalities of Depression-era America. The military provided remedial education and medical treatment on a massive scale. It also classified recruits and trained them for an increasingly technical war. The typical soldier was not a professional warrior. He was a citizen drafted or enlisted from civilian life, trained in camps built almost overnight, and absorbed into a military organization that emphasized logistics, firepower, and standardized equipment. The M1 Garand rifle, radios, trucks, artillery, and abundant ammunition reflected the industrial system behind the Army. American divisions were designed to call on powerful supporting arms rather than fight in isolation. By June 1944, Britain had become an immense staging area. Supplies arrived by the millions of tons. Vehicles filled fields and roads. Airfields covered the countryside. Thousands of vessels assembled for the invasion. On the night of June 5th and morning of June 6th, airborne troops crossed first, followed by amphibious forces landing on 5 beaches in Normandy. The airborne landings were scattered, but the confusion sometimes helped by making German commanders uncertain about Allied strength and objectives. American paratroopers fought around towns and causeways behind Utah Beach. At St. Mary-Glise, airborne troops secured one of the first French towns liberated in the invasion. Omaha Beach became the most dangerous landing zone. German defenses remained strong. Currents and navigation errors disrupted assault formations, and many amphibious tanks and engineering units were lost before or during the landing. Infantrymen were pinned below bluffs under artillery, machine gun, and mortar fire. Small groups eventually moved through gaps and climbed the heights. By the end of the day, the beachhead existed, but at severe cost. The British and Canadians established themselves on the eastern beaches, but did not immediately take Caen, a major objective. The Allies had succeeded in landing, yet the following weeks produced a difficult battle of attrition. Normandy's hedgerow country favored defenders. Thick earthen banks divided fields into small compartments and concealed German infantry, anti-tank weapons, and armor. American units had to learn how to combine infantry, tanks, engineers, artillery, and air support in terrain that neutralized some of their mobility. The breakthrough came with Operation Cobra in late July. Heavy bombing shattered part of the German front, though short bombing caused American casualties as well. Once a gap opened, mechanized forces poured through. George Patton's Third Army became operational and raced into Brittany and then eastward. The static Normandy battle transformed into a war of movement. German forces were nearly trapped around Falaise. Paris was liberated in August, with French forces entering the capital and de Gaulle quickly asserting political authority. Allied armies advanced so rapidly that their logistical systems struggled to keep pace. Fuel and ammunition had to travel hundreds of miles from beaches and the few usable ports. This supply problem shaped the next strategic dispute. Eisenhower favored a broad front advance, maintaining pressure across the theater and preventing the Germans from concentrating against a single thrust. British commander Bernard Montgomery argued for a concentrated drive through the north toward the Ruhr. Neither approach could escape the central reality that armies could not advance faster than their supplies. Operation Market Garden in September attempted to leap across the Netherlands by dropping airborne troops to seize a chain of bridges, while a narrow armored column advanced to meet them. The plan came close to success but failed at Arnhem, where British airborne troops encountered stronger German forces than expected and could not hold the final bridge. The hope for rapid path into Germany disappeared. The capture of Antwerp offered a solution to the supply crisis, but the Scheldt estuary had to be cleared before ships could use the port. The delay gave Germany time to rebuild its western defenses. The Allied advance stalled near the German border. Hitler used that pause for a final major counteroffensive. In December 1944, German forces attacked through the Ardennes, recreating the geographic surprise of 1940. Poor weather initially grounded Allied aircraft. The German advance created the bulge that gave the battle its familiar name. American units at Bastogne were surrounded, and a German surrender demand produced Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's celebrated one-word reply, "Nuts." The offensive failed. German forces lacked enough fuel and could not break through to Antwerp. Once the weather cleared, Allied aircraft attacked roads in columns. Patton shifted his army north with remarkable speed to relieve Bastogne. By January, the front had largely been restored, but both sides had suffered heavy losses. Germany had spent reserves it could not replace. Air power was also crippling the German economy. Kennedy gives a qualified judgment on strategic bombing. Bombing had not broken German civilian morale, as pre-war theorists predicted, and the enormous attacks on cities inflicted appalling civilian casualties. Yet concentrated attacks on oil production and transportation in 1944 had significant military effects. Synthetic fuel output collapsed, pilot training suffered, rail movement deteriorated, and armored units increasingly lacked gasoline. In March 1945, American forces unexpectedly captured a bridge across the Rhine at Remagen before German engineers could destroy it. Other crossings followed. Allied armies encircled the Ruhr and swept into central Germany. By April, American troops reached the Elbe. Eisenhower declined to race the Soviet army for Berlin because the city lay in the zone already assigned to Soviet occupation, and because he saw no military justification for additional casualties. That decision symbolized a transition already underway. Germany was collapsing, but the location of Western and Soviet armies was determining the post-war division of Europe. The alliance that defeated Hitler was approaching victory at the same moment its members were becoming geopolitical rivals. The American Army's structure in France reflected a deliberate choice to substitute machinery and firepower for manpower whenever possible. Infantry still suffered most battlefield casualties, but American units could call on dense artillery support, tactical aircraft, tank destroyers, engineers, and motor transport. This system consumed extraordinary amounts of ammunition and fuel. The real measure of American military strength was therefore not simply the number of divisions, but the industrial and logistical apparatus behind each division. Normandy also demonstrated the limits of technology. Heavy preliminary bombing did not automatically destroy prepared defenses. Tanks could not easily cross hedgerows. Air superiority could isolate the battlefield, but could not occupy villages. Infantrymen still had to move through fields, woods, and towns under fire. Kennedy's narrative preserves this human scale even while emphasizing material superiority. The pursuit across France then exposed the opposite problem. Battlefield success could outrun logistics. The Red Ball Express and other truck systems carried fuel and supplies forward, but trucks themselves consumed fuel and wore out. ports mattered more than glamorous armored advances. Antwerp was one of Europe's best harbors, yet it could not support the armies until the approaches through the Scheldt were cleared. Strategy remained bounded by transport. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's attempt to exploit those limitations and split the alliance. Surprise was real, but the offensive depended on capturing Allied fuel and maintaining a schedule that German logistics could not sustain. American resistance at road junctions slowed the advance until weather improved and reinforcements arrived. The battle consumed experienced German troops and armor at a moment when Soviet forces were preparing their own massive offensive in the east. By the final months, German defeat was no longer primarily a question of whether, but of who would occupy which territory. Eisenhower's halt short of Berlin followed military and political arrangements already made with the Soviets. Critics later imagined the city as a prize the Americans could have taken, but Kennedy emphasizes that sacrificing soldiers for territory assigned to Soviet occupation would not have changed the agreed post-war boundary. The deeper post-war struggle would be political, not a race for one ruined capital. Combat in Northwest Europe also revealed the enormous replacement problem. Infantry rifle companies suffered disproportionately high casualties, and the Army struggled to supply trained replacements with sufficient cohesion. Men often arrived individually in units whose veterans had already formed bonds through combat. The replacement system kept divisions numerically alive, but could leave new soldiers isolated and vulnerable. Material abundance could not fully solve the human problem of replacing experienced infantry. The liberation of Europe brought Americans face to face with Nazi crimes. As Allied armies entered Germany, they discovered concentration camps and forced labor sites. The scale and physical evidence of persecution gave a concrete meaning to a war that many soldiers had initially understood, mainly in strategic or patriotic terms. The encounter also sharpened post-war questions about guilt, occupation, and reconstruction. By April 1945, the Western and Soviet armies approached each other after advancing from opposite directions across a ruined continent. Their meeting symbolized both victory and division. The common enemy that had held the coalition together was disappearing. Military occupation zones, reparations, borders, and political systems would soon become the subjects of conflict among the victors. The advance into Germany also confronted soldiers with a civilian population very different from the enemy image constructed during mobilization. Cities were ruined, refugees crowded roads, and ordinary Germans faced hunger and displacement. Occupation policy had to distinguish punishment of the Nazi regime from administration of a society that the Allies would have to feed and govern. This practical problem helped push American policy away from schemes to permanently destroy German economic capacity. Military victory, therefore, immediately generated governance. The same army that had crossed Normandy now had to manage prisoners, displaced persons, local authorities, public health, and infrastructure. The transition foreshadowed the enormous post-war administrative role the United States would assume in both Germany and Japan. Chapter 21. The Cauldron of the Home Front. The war transformed American society not only by creating jobs and military power, but by moving people on a scale unprecedented in the nation's history. Kennedy describes the home front as a cauldron because mobilization mixed populations that had previously been separated by region, race, occupation, and gender. The result was prosperity and opportunity, but also congestion, discrimination, violence, and social tensions, whose consequences would last long after 1945. Military mobilization alone displaced enormous numbers. 15 million men and several 100,000 women left home for training, and most male service members eventually went overseas. Civilian migration was almost as dramatic. About 15 million civilians changed their county of residence in the years after Pearl Harbor. By war's end, roughly 1 American in 5 had been caught up in wartime migration. 2 broad streams dominated. People moved from the south toward northern industrial cities, and even more strongly from east to west. California, Oregon, and Washington expanded at extraordinary rates. Shipyards, aircraft plants, steel mills, and military installations drew workers to Los Angeles, San Diego, Oakland, Seattle, Portland, Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and other centers of war production. Many migrants settled in newly expanding suburbs, foreshadowing the geography of the post-war era. The movement created housing shortages and strained transportation, schools, hospitals, and municipal services. Workers could earn wages unimaginable during the Depression, yet struggle to find a room. Federal authorities built temporary housing and tried to manage local bottlenecks. The war economy created abundance at the national level while generating scarcity in particular cities and commodities. One of the darkest homefront measures was the removal and incarceration of Japanese-Americans. After Pearl Harbor, military authorities and West Coast politicians claimed that residents of Japanese ancestry posed a security threat. Evidence for a mass conspiracy was absent. The pressure instead drew heavily on racial prejudice, economic rivalry, and wartime fear. General John DeWitt argued that Japanese Americans could not reliably be distinguished as loyal or disloyal. Justice Department officials resisted the policy, and Attorney General Francis Biddle recognized the constitutional danger. Secretary of War Henry Stimson also had doubts. Roosevelt nevertheless signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, authorizing military exclusion zones. More than 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, were eventually removed from the West Coast. Families were told to leave homes, farms, and businesses with little time to protect their property. Some first lived in makeshift assembly centers, such as converted racetracks, before being transferred to remote relocation camps. Barbed wire, guard towers, communal facilities, heat, cold, dust, and loss of privacy made clear that this was confinement, whatever bureaucratic terminology the government used. The War Relocation Authority tried to create schools, newspapers, farms, and local institutions inside the camps. A loyalty questionnaire later divided residents further, producing the stigmatized category of so-called no-no respondents, who rejected or resented questions about allegiance and military service. At the same time, thousands of Japanese American soldiers served in the armed forces. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team fought with distinction in Europe. The Supreme Court upheld the exclusion in Korematsu v. United States. Kennedy treats the decision as a judicial travesty shaped by distorted information and deference to military claims. Decades later, Congress apologized and compensated surviving detainees. The episode demonstrated how quickly constitutional protections could contract when race and national security reinforced one another. Black Americans experienced a different combination of discrimination and opportunity. The armed forces remained segregated. Army leaders, including Marshall, rejected the idea that wartime mobilization should become what he called a sociological laboratory. Black troops were disproportionately assigned to service functions, and educational inequalities produced lower average classification scores because many Southern black recruits had attended severely underfunded schools. The military itself exposed those inequalities statistically. A much higher proportion of black registrants were rejected as physically unfit, and many recruits needed literacy training. The Army eventually taught more than 150,000 black soldiers to read. Black combat units existed but were limited, and distrust between white officers and black troops damaged morale. The Tuskegee Airmen nevertheless demonstrated the competence of black pilots, while units such as the 761st Tank Battalion served effectively in combat. During the Battle of the Bulge, manpower shortages led the Army to create some integrated rifle platoons, whose performance weakened arguments for permanent segregation. Full military desegregation would come under Harry Truman in 1948. A. Philip Randolph pushed the federal government further on civilian employment. Frustrated by discrimination in defense plans and segregation in the military, he threatened a mass march of black Americans on Washington in 1941. Roosevelt, eager to avoid a major protest in the Capitol as mobilization accelerated, issued Executive Order 8802. It prohibited discrimination in defense employment and created the Fair Employment Practice Committee. The order did not end racism, and its enforcement was initially weak, but it marked the first major federal commitment to equal employment opportunity since Reconstruction. The FEPC was later strengthened, and black representation in defense work rose substantially. The NAACP expanded rapidly, while the Pittsburgh Courier promoted the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and racial discrimination at home. The Congress of Racial Equality began direct action campaigns against segregation. Economic opportunity accelerated the Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands of black Southerners left for northern and western cities during the war, and millions more followed afterward. A domestic worker earning a few dollars a week in the South could become an aircraft worker, earning many times that amount in California. These moves changed income, education, political participation, and expectations. Contact did not automatically produce tolerance. Housing competition and workplace integration provoked white resistance. Hate strikes occurred when white workers refused to work beside black employees. Riots erupted in several cities. Detroit's 1943 violence left dozens dead after rumors and street clashes escalated into racial warfare. Mexican-American youths in Los Angeles were attacked during the Zoot Suit disturbances. Military bases experienced their own racial conflicts. Women also entered paid employment in unprecedented numbers. Popular memory later condensed this change into the figure of Rosie the Riveter. Kennedy complicates that image. Nearly 19 million women worked for wages at some point during the war, but only a minority were industrial riveters. Women served as clerks, teachers, sales workers, domestic workers, nurses, factory employees, and agricultural laborers. Hundreds of thousands joined uniformed women's services, such as the WACs and WAVEs, while others volunteered in civilian programs. The war opened jobs previously considered male, especially in aircraft, shipbuilding, and munitions. Wages could be far higher than in traditional women's occupations. Employers who had resisted hiring women suddenly advertised for them. Government propaganda encouraged women to treat industrial work as patriotic service. Yet the transformation had limits. Many married women faced a double burden of paid work and household responsibility. Childcare was scarce. Employers often maintained sex-based job categories and wage differences. Women were frequently told that their wartime positions were temporary, and that returning veterans would reclaim them. At war's end, many women did leave defense jobs, though female labor force participation remained higher than before the war. The long-run effect was therefore neither a complete return to pre-war norms nor a simple wartime emancipation. Labor relations became increasingly controlled by the federal government. Unions had agreed to avoid strikes in exchange for a place in the mobilization system, while the National War Labor Board regulated wage disputes. Price controls and rationing attempted to prevent military demand and scarce civilian goods from producing runaway inflation. Gasoline, tires, meat, sugar, and other commodities were rationed. Wage controls were imperfect, and workers often pursued higher earnings through job changes, overtime, or reclassification. Despite no strike pledges, labor conflict did not disappear. John L. Lewis led the coal miners into wartime strikes, infuriating Roosevelt and Congress. The Smith-Connolly Act authorized federal seizure of struck war plants and imposed restrictions on unions. Roosevelt vetoed the measure, but Congress overrode him. The episode showed that labor's political gains in the New Deal did not give unions unrestricted power during national mobilization. Wartime prosperity nevertheless transformed material expectations. Farm income rose. Industrial wages increased. Unemployment virtually disappeared. Savings accumulated because consumers had high incomes, but limited access to cars, appliances, housing, and other durable goods. This suppressed demand would help fuel the post-war boom. The war also began changing the political meaning of equality. Mobilization exposed contradictions between a war fought against racist dictatorships and segregation at home. Federal intervention in defense employment, mass black migration, military service, and the growth of civil rights organizations did not end Jim Crow, but they created conditions in which the post-war civil rights movement could become a national political force. Kennedy's home front is therefore neither an uncomplicated story of unity nor simply a catalog of injustice. War acted as an accelerator. It pulled people out of old communities, placed them in new workplaces, expanded federal authority, increased incomes, intensified conflicts, and forced Americans to confront contradictions that Depression-era immobility had often concealed. Wartime migration also permanently changed congressional and electoral geography. Population moved toward the West and toward metropolitan areas whose defense industries had expanded. California's explosive growth foreshadowed the rise of the Sun Belt. Federal investment in aircraft plants, shipyards, military bases, highways, and research facilities helped shift economic weight toward regions that would become increasingly important after the war. The internment policy was geographically selective in a revealing way. Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where they made up a far larger share of the population and were essential to the economy, were not subjected to mass removal on the same scale. Nor were people of Japanese ancestry living outside the West Coast military zone generally confined. These differences weakened the claim that race itself constituted an unavoidable military threat, and underscored the role of West Coast politics and prejudice. Wartime civil rights gains were similarly uneven. Executive Order 8802 could pressure defense contractors because federal procurement gave Washington leverage. It did not abolish segregation in schools, housing, voting, or the armed forces. Yet it established a crucial principle. The federal government could condition economic participation on non-discrimination. Post-war activists would push that principle into wider areas of public life. Women faced another mixed legacy. The war proved that they could perform skilled industrial and military support jobs from which employers had excluded them, but propaganda often framed their labor as temporary patriotic substitution rather than a permanent claim to occupational equality. When veterans returned, many women were dismissed or moved back into traditionally female work. Even so, the experience expanded expectations and increased the number of married women who would seek paid employment in subsequent decades. The homefront conflicts over race, gender, labor, and migration are central to Kennedy's theme because wartime unity was never complete. Americans fought a common enemy while negotiating, who counted fully within the democracy they claimed to defend. The post-war rights revolution would grow directly out of those unresolved wartime contradictions. The wartime boom also reduced some regional poverty by pulling labor out of low-productivity agriculture. Migrants who left southern farms or Great Plains communities often never returned. Remittances and returning veterans carried new expectations back to places that had been isolated from industrial wages. The movement accelerated the long decline of the sharecropping system and changed the political weight of rural America. At the same time, the war expanded federal surveillance and security powers. Loyalty investigations, censorship arrangements, military exclusion, and prosecutions reflected legitimate fears of espionage and sabotage, but sometimes blurred into suppression of dissent or racial suspicion. The Japanese-American incarceration was the most extreme example, but the broader wartime state also established precedents for national security administration that would continue into the Cold War. Consumer life on the home front also illustrated the paradox of wartime prosperity. The government encouraged citizens to save, buy bonds, conserve materials, and accept rationing because private consumption competed with military production. Families waited for automobiles, household appliances, and new housing while incomes rose. Unlike the Depression, when stores held goods that people could not afford, wartime households often possessed money they could not freely spend. The reversal accumulated purchasing power that would surge into civilian markets once reconversion began. Federal price controls helped prevent that excess demand from turning into runaway inflation. Enforcement required millions of ordinary interactions: ration books, price ceilings, local boards, coupons, and citizen monitoring. Complaints and evasion were common, but the system kept wartime inflation within limits compatible with political stability. It was another demonstration that economic management, once considered extraordinary, had become routine under emergency conditions. The war also changed organized labor's position. Union membership rose, but unions accepted wage restraints and no-strike commitments in return for federal recognition and maintenance of membership provisions in many contracts. This arrangement institutionalized labor inside the mobilization state while limiting its freedom of action. When coal miners struck, Roosevelt's anger reflected the belief that collective bargaining rights carried obligations during national emergency. The conflict anticipated post-war disputes over whether unions had become too powerful. Chapter 22. Endgame. The final year of the war brought military victory together with political transition. Roosevelt entered 1945 physically exhausted and seriously ill. At his fourth inauguration in January, observers were struck by his gaunt appearance. He had lost substantial weight, and doctors had diagnosed severe hypertension and heart disease. Roosevelt concealed the seriousness of his condition from the public and continued working despite sharply reduced physical capacity. The central diplomatic meeting was the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Crimea, while Soviet armies occupied much of Eastern Europe and advanced toward Berlin. The military situation gave Stalin enormous leverage. The Red Army had paid the greatest battlefield price in Europe and now physically controlled territories whose political future the Western Allies hoped to influence. Poland became the most difficult question. The Soviet Union sponsored a government centered on communist-backed leaders in Lublin, while Britain and the United States had relations with the Polish government in exile in London. Stalin argued that a friendly Polish government was essential to Soviet security after repeated invasions from the West. Western leaders demanded broader representation and elections. Agreements at Yalta used language flexible enough for each side to claim success, but Soviet military control ultimately mattered more than diplomatic wording. The occupation and future of Germany raised similar questions. Policymakers had considered very harsh plans. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau proposed reducing Germany's heavy industrial capacity and turning much of the country toward an agricultural economy. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Secretary of War Stimson warned that economically destroying Germany would also damage Europe and could recreate the grievances that had followed the First World War. The Morgenthau approach lost influence as officials moved toward reconstruction rather than permanent pastoralization. Yalta also addressed the Soviet entry into the war against Japan. American planners still expected a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands and valued Soviet assistance. Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific War after Germany's defeat in exchange for strategic concessions in Asia. Roosevelt also sought Soviet participation in the new United Nations, hoping a structure of great power cooperation could avoid the institutional failures that followed the First World War. Roosevelt returned from Yalta through the Middle East and met leaders including Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. His discussion of Palestine and Jewish refugees revealed how quickly wartime diplomacy was opening post-war problems. The president then returned to the United States, visibly weakened. On April 12, 1945, while resting at Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. He had been president for more than 12 years and had guided the country through nearly the entire Depression and most of the war. Harry Truman, who had been vice president only a few months and had been kept outside many major strategic secrets, suddenly inherited the presidency. Europe was already approaching collapse. Soviet troops fought through Berlin. Hitler killed himself in his bunker on April 30th. Benito Mussolini had been captured and executed days earlier. Germany's successor government, under Admiral Karl Donitz, surrendered unconditionally. The European War ended in May 1945. The Pacific War remained. The United States had built an immense carrier force capable of operating for long periods across the ocean. Fast carrier task forces supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, repair ships, hospital vessels, and other auxiliaries gave the Navy mobile air power on a scale Japan could no longer match. The Central Pacific Offensive had taken the Marshalls and Marianas. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 devastated Japanese naval aviation in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam brought the Japanese home islands within range of B-29 bombers. MacArthur's forces returned to the Philippines, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf destroyed much of Japan's remaining ability to conduct major fleet operations. The island campaigns grew more costly as American forces approached Japan. Iwo Jima provided airfields near the home islands, but required a bloody assault against deeply fortified defenders. Okinawa was even larger and more destructive. Kamikaze attacks inflicted heavy naval losses. The battle suggested what an invasion of the Japanese main islands might cost. Strategic bombing became more devastating under General Curtis LeMay. High-altitude precision bombing had produced disappointing results because of weather, winds, mechanical problems, and the dispersed nature of Japanese industry. LeMay shifted B-29 operations to low-altitude night attacks using incendiaries against cities built largely of wood and paper. The Tokyo raid of March 9 and 10, 1945, created a firestorm that killed roughly 90,000 people and left about 1 million homeless. Over the following months, American bombers burned large portions of dozens of Japanese cities. Kennedy emphasizes that the atomic bombings came after a conventional bombing campaign that had already normalized the mass destruction of urban populations. The Manhattan Project was now ready to produce a new weapon. Truman learned in detail about the project after becoming president. In July, the first nuclear device was successfully tested in New Mexico. The explosion transformed the options available to the administration, though policymakers still had to decide how and against what target to use the bomb. At Potsdam in July, the Allies demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, and warned of prompt and utter destruction. Some senior American officials favored modifying the demand to assure Japan that Emperor Hirohito could remain in some symbolic role. They believed the imperial institution might facilitate surrender and later occupation. Secretary of State James Burns and others worried that any retreat from unconditional surrender would look like appeasement. The Potsdam Declaration, therefore, did not explicitly guarantee the emperor. Japan's government was divided. Military leaders hoped to inflict enough casualties on an invasion to obtain better terms. Other officials understood that defeat was inevitable. Tokyo also sought Soviet mediation, not realizing that Stalin was preparing to enter the war against Japan as promised at Yalta. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was devastated, and tens of thousands died immediately or soon afterward. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. On August 9, a second atomic bomb destroyed much of Nagasaki. Kennedy presents the Japanese surrender as the result of converging shocks rather than reducing it to a single cause. The atomic bombs demonstrated an unprecedented capacity for destruction. Soviet entry eliminated hope that Moscow could broker a favorable settlement and threatened Japanese positions across Asia. Conventional bombing and blockade had already devastated the economy. The leadership now faced national destruction. Emperor Hirohito intervened directly. Japan offered to surrender if the imperial institution could be preserved. Washington replied that the emperor and government would be subject to the authority of the Allied Supreme Commander, language ambiguous enough to permit acceptance. Some Japanese officers still resisted and attempted to seize the recording of the emperor's surrender message, but they failed. On August 15th, Hirohito's voice was broadcast to the Japanese people, announcing the end of the war. American troops celebrated across the Pacific and Europe. Men preparing to invade Japan understood that they might now survive. The killing that had shaped a generation was finally ending. Roosevelt's death created a dramatic continuity problem. Truman had not been fully briefed on Yalta's complexities, the atomic bomb project, or many military discussions. The vice presidency had been politically important in the 1944 election, but institutionally marginal in wartime decision-making. Within hours, a former Missouri senator had to assume responsibility for issues that Roosevelt had managed through years of personal relationships with Churchill, Stalin, military commanders, and senior advisors. The decision to use atomic bombs has remained one of the most debated questions in American history. Kennedy situates it within the strategic assumptions of 1945. American planners expected invasion operations against Kyushu and Honshu, and recent battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa suggested fierce resistance. Firebombing had already killed civilians on a massive scale, so policymakers did not confront Hiroshima as the first decision to attack cities. The new weapon appeared to many officials as an extension, though an extraordinary one, of an existing campaign to compel surrender. At the same time, some officials believed Japan's position was already hopeless, and that clarifying the emperor's future might secure surrender without invasion. Others emphasized Soviet entry, blockade, and conventional bombing. Kennedy's narrative does not make the outcome depend on one instrument alone. Japan's decision followed a cluster of shocks compressed into days. Hiroshima, Soviet intervention, Nagasaki, and the emperor's unprecedented involvement in government decision-making. The preservation of the emperor after surrender also exposed the practical flexibility hidden inside the public phrase, unconditional surrender. The United States ultimately accepted an occupation system that used Hirohito as a symbolic institution under Allied authority. The arrangement helped facilitate compliance with occupation orders, even though Washington had refused to guarantee it explicitly before the bombs were used. Victory, therefore, ended the fighting without resolving every moral or political controversy produced by the war. Decisions made under assumptions about casualties, diplomacy, racism, empire, and strategic necessity would become subjects of historical argument precisely because the United States emerged powerful enough to define much of the post-war order. The end of the war also revealed the asymmetry of destruction. The continental United States had experienced anxiety, rationing, military casualties, and isolated attacks, but its cities and industrial base remained intact. Europe, the Soviet Union, China, and Japan had suffered immense physical devastation. This difference left the United States with a uniquely large share of world industrial capacity in 1945 and gave Washington financial leverage over Reconstruction. The atomic bomb intensified that asymmetry further. For a brief period, the United States possessed a weapon no other country had. The monopoly did not last, but it immediately affected post-war diplomacy and reinforced the sense that scientific and industrial capacity had become central measures of national power. The debate over Japan's surrender terms cannot be separated from domestic politics. Roosevelt and then Truman had repeatedly promised unconditional surrender. After years of casualties, any public suggestion that Japan's political system would be preserved risked appearing to reward aggression. Officials who favored retaining the emperor, therefore, had to distinguish between keeping Hirohito as a controlled symbol and accepting the sovereignty claimed by imperial ideology. The ambiguity of the eventual reply allowed both strategic practicality and the public rhetoric of victory to coexist. The Soviet offensive in Manchuria was rapid and devastating. Japanese leaders had hoped Moscow might mediate with the Western Allies. But Soviet entry destroyed that diplomatic option and threatened Japanese forces across Northeast Asia. For some members of the Japanese leadership, this strategic collapse was at least as alarming as the atomic bombings. Kennedy's account keeps these events together because the surrender decision emerged from their cumulative pressure. American occupation would soon convert wartime victory into institutional reconstruction. General MacArthur, whose escape from the Philippines had been one of the war's early humiliations, would return as supreme commander in a position of extraordinary authority. Japan would be demilitarized and politically transformed under American supervision. Germany, too, would be occupied and reconstructed. Victory therefore imposed responsibilities that contradicted the older American desire to fight wars and then withdraw from foreign political commitments. Epilogue: The World the War Made. Kennedy closes by asking what the Depression and war left behind. By the end of 1945, most of the political leaders who had dominated the era were gone. Roosevelt had died. Hitler and Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye had taken their own lives. Churchill had been voted out of office. Stalin remained, and the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was already giving way to the Cold War. The war ended the older American tradition of strategic isolation. The United States emerged with troops, bases, alliances, economic commitments, and responsibilities around the world. Yet Kennedy suggests that the Cold War, important as it was, may not have been the war's most durable international legacy. The United States had spent much of the interwar period defending war debt repayment, high tariffs, and national economic autonomy. After 1945, it helped construct almost the opposite system. It supported the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, later financed European recovery through the Marshall Plan, promoted lower trade barriers through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and encouraged European integration. The country that had helped undermine the London Economic Conference in 1933 became the principal architect of a more integrated international economic order. This change laid foundations for the post-war process, later called globalization. Trade, capital, institutions, and cultural exchange crossed borders on a scale that would have been difficult to imagine during the protectionist 1930s. Kennedy, therefore, places the creation of an interdependent economic order beside the Cold War as a central consequence of American wartime power. At home, the war finally ended the Depression. Military expenditure proved beyond doubt that government spending could mobilize idle resources on a scale no peacetime New Deal program had attempted. Full employment, high wages, accumulated savings, and industrial expansion prepared the country for a quarter-century of extraordinary post-war growth. Veterans returned to a society that had also created new pathways into the middle class. The GI Bill financed education, training, and homeownership for millions of former service members. Combined with New Deal mortgage institutions and wartime savings, it helped accelerate suburbanization and expand college attendance. A young family in 1950 could live in a new house equipped with electricity, indoor plumbing, a refrigerator, washing machine, radio, telephone, and increasingly television, comforts far removed from the insecurity many Americans had known in the early 1930s. The post-war order contained contradictions. Racial segregation remained, even as wartime migration and activism had strengthened the struggle against it. Women had entered new occupations, but often faced pressure to return to traditional roles. The Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons, communists took power in China, and the peace Roosevelt had imagined gave way to a new geopolitical confrontation. Still, Kennedy explains why Americans remembered the Second World War as a good war. It had defeated regimes widely understood as aggressive and murderous. It had ended the economic ordeal of the Depression. It had left the United States richer, stronger, and more internationally powerful than ever before. It seemed to vindicate both democratic government and American industrial society. The phrase freedom from fear, therefore, acquires several meanings by the end of the book. In the 1930s, it meant security against unemployment, bank failure, homelessness, and old age. During the war, it meant protection against military aggression and dictatorship. Afterward, it became part of a broader national expectation that democratic government, economic prosperity, and international leadership could together produce a safer future. Kennedy does not present that future as guaranteed. The world created by the war contained nuclear weapons, ideological rivalry, unresolved racial injustice, and new forms of responsibility. But the United States that entered the post-war era was fundamentally different from the country of 1929. Depression and war had enlarged the federal government, strengthened organized labor and social insurance, transformed the geography of population and industry, accelerated civil rights demands, created a permanent national security establishment, and ended America's reluctance to exercise sustained global power. Americans could not escape the results of the war because those results had become the institutional framework of their new society. The post-war domestic settlement also linked the New Deal and wartime mobilization. Social security, banking reform, mortgage insurance, labor institutions, and federal administrative capacity had been created in the 1930s. War then supplied full employment, mass taxation, technological investment, and enormous industrial growth. The prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s rested on both sets of institutions rather than on a simple rejection of the New Deal once war arrived. The GI Bill illustrates the combination. It treated veterans, education, and housing as public obligations while channeling benefits through private colleges, banks, builders, and labor markets. Millions entered higher education who might otherwise never have attended. Mortgage guarantees helped families buy homes. These programs expanded the middle class while also reproducing racial inequalities, where local institutions denied black veterans equal access. The international economic order likewise learned from the failures of the 1930s. American officials no longer assumed that creditor virtue and balanced payments would automatically produce stability. Institutions created at Bretton Woods were designed to provide liquidity and reconstruction, while discouraging the destructive currency and trade blocs that had accompanied the Depression. Economic leadership became a permanent component of national security. Kennedy ends with neither triumphalism nor cynicism. The generation that survived depression and war had reason to feel that democratic institutions had passed extraordinary tests, but the security they created depended on continuing political choices. Freedom from fear was not a final condition achieved in 1945. It was a claim about what government and international order should try to make possible after Americans had learned how destructive unchecked economic collapse and global war could become. The economic lessons Americans drew from the era were not uniform. Some credited New Deal reform for stabilizing capitalism. Others concluded that only wartime spending had truly ended the Depression. Conservatives emphasized private industry's production miracle, while liberals emphasized the federal contracts, taxation, planning, and demand that made the production possible. Post-war politics would debate those interpretations while accepting many institutions created by both mobilizations. What changed most permanently was the scale of expectations. Citizens who had seen Washington close every bank, insure deposits, employ millions, mobilize 16 million service members, build global fleets, finance scientific laboratories, and help organize a world economy, could no longer think of the federal government as the remote institution of 1929. The political question after 1945 was not whether national power existed, but how it should be used. The generation entering adulthood after the war inherited both confidence and anxiety. Economic growth, education benefits, housing construction, and technological abundance suggested that the insecurity of the Depression had been conquered. At the same time, atomic weapons and Soviet rivalry created a new form of fear beyond anything contemplated in the 1930s. The phrase, freedom from fear, thus remained aspirational even at the moment of triumph. Kennedy's broadest conclusion is that the two crises enlarged the American state without destroying the constitutional order. The government acquired powers over banking, welfare, labor, taxation, production, science, and foreign affairs that would have astonished Americans in 1929. Yet those powers remained embedded in elections, courts, Congress, private enterprise, and an adversarial political culture. The resulting system was neither the limited republic of the 1920s nor the centralized authoritarian model visible abroad. It was a new form of American liberal state created through emergency and carried into the post-war world. The transformation was therefore cumulative. Depression reform created institutions, wartime mobilization supplied scale, and victory gave the United States resources and obligations that made retreat to the political economy of the 1920s impossible.